Hello, everyone, and welcome to another in our series of events from the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions here at Princeton University. I'm Alan C. Guelzo, the director of the Madison Program's Initiative on Politics and Statesmanship, and the Thomas W. Smith Distinguished Research Scholar in the Madison Program.
I'm Shilo Brooks, the Assistant Director of the Madison Program and lecturer in the Department of Politics.
And we are prepared to take you on quite an intellectual ride this afternoon. So put your tray tables in the upright position and your seatbelts on. We're about to fly. It's college recruitment season, if you hadn't noticed. And what is it that we should know about college recruitment season?
Well, William Deresiewicz has published a fascinating article, a series of articles, beginning in 2014 in the New Republic, where he urged us to look a little bit more closely at the college recruiting process. He said, quote, "Look beneath the facade of seamless well-adjustment," and he had in mind there the Ivy League, "and what you often find are toxic levels of fear, anxiety, depression, emptiness, aimlessness, and isolation. And what's the cause of all the torment? Well, he argued that that's the Ivy League. Its recruitment strategies are shams, its classrooms promote elite groupthink, the professoriate are ruled by posturing and careerism." So he wrote this book, The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life. He followed that book with an engrossing and courageous series of articles and reviews on modern university life.
William Deresiewicz was born in New Jersey in 1964, did an undergraduate degree in biology and psychology, a master's in journalism, and a PhD in English, all from Columbia University. From 1998 till 2008, he taught at Yale. He wanted to be a teacher, most of all, but he found that teaching is not always what the modern university puts its chips on. He left university life to become a writer, and well, no surprise, a lot of his writing has to do with the upside down priorities of elite American education. And all of that culminates in the collection of pieces that we want to talk about this afternoon, and that is The End of Solitude.
So as we continue forward in the webinar, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. At any time tonight, you can click that Q&A box and submit your questions. It doesn't have to be at the end. It can be any time. You can submit your questions, and about 30 minutes before the end of the event, we'll stop and pose some of your questions to Bill. So without further ado, Alan, please take it away.
William Deresiewicz, let me start right away with the title of your book, The End of Solitude. These days, people fear solitude. We fear being alone. We want to be liked, and social media turns that want into an obsession. And generally speaking, the younger, the more obsessed. But we also seem to have more solitude on our hands than we want. In a study by the Survey Center on American Life, 12% of Americans say they have no close friends, compared to 3% in 1990. And we know from Robert Putnam that Americans now bowl alone and live in an atmosphere of what he called cyber balkanization. But you argue that solitude is a blessing. Tell us how it blesses, and tell us whom it should bless.
Well, first of all, thanks everyone for having me here and for showing up for this. Those of you who are listening right now and looking right now. I think to answer your question, first of all, I have to define solitude. Solitude is not the same thing as being alone. Being alone is an objective state. There are different ways that we can respond to that state. We can feel lonely, or we can feel what I call solitude. Loneliness is obviously a state of distress. It's a state of absence. It's a state of emptiness. And what I call solitude is similar to, in some ways, to what Whitman calls idleness. It's a state of receptivity. It's a state of fullness. It's an ability to be alone with oneself in a rich way. And it can be enacted through a number of means. You can just be sitting and thinking, meditating, or reading, or in some sense, to stretch the meaning a little bit, I think even deep friendship is a kind of form of solitude in the sense that it brings us to ourselves. I should say that I started to write about this. So The End of Solitude is the name of the collection. It's a selection of my essays from the last 15 plus years. And the title of the book is also the title of an essay that I wrote in 2009, The End of Solitude. And the germ of it came to me when I was teaching a course at Yale. It was actually a course in literature of friendship, but I guess not surprisingly, one day we got around to talking about solitude. And one of my students said, the truth is I don't like being alone. And even when I have a paper to write, I'll go sit in a friend's room, while they do something else. And another student said, why would anybody want to be alone? What can you do by yourself that you can't do with other people? To go back to that first remark, though, I don't like feeling alone. I think it speaks to the way you framed the question. So, meaning that the increase in our loneliness, which is clearly the case, I think is in some ways related to our loss of solitude. I mean, they have similar causes, namely the internet and various other forms of atomization. But I also, as with my student, she couldn't cope with solitude because she couldn't deal with loneliness, maybe because there was so much of it in her life. That's a first answer to your question.
I want to ask you a question about a couple of the essays that tie together. There's two really wonderful pieces, one on leadership at the very beginning, and one called The Neoliberal Arts toward the middle of your book. And in both essays, leadership comes up. And I was struck by the fact that in the Neoliberal Arts essay, you talk about visiting a college president, and you've gone around this college and everybody's talking about leadership. And you're like, what does that even mean? And you ask this college president, what does he think the mission of the college is? And he says leadership. And then it becomes unclear that he doesn't really know what that means. And then in this West Point essay, you talk about the relationship between solitude and leadership, and the fact that some of the virtues of genuine leadership, or what we might call character, are cultivated precisely through solitude. But you say that there's a crisis of leadership. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that crisis, its character and its nature, and then talk a little bit more about what you think the solution is, given that you've seen the cheapness of that term implemented in higher education on so many occasions.
Right. Okay, so just to explain, that essay, The End of Solitude, came out in 2009, and some people, one of whom was a friend of mine, an old graduate student who had been a TA of mine and was teaching at West Point. A number of people in the English department at West Point saw the piece and wanted me to come to talk to the plebe class, the first year class, about solitude. And I thought, okay, I've spent my whole life in the Ivy League. I'm used to I know how to talk to those kinds of students. I was one of those students. Many of the people I know, it's my milieu. West Point, I suspected correctly, had a very different student population with different values, different interests. How was I going to talk to them about solitude in a way that they weren't going to tune out after 5 minutes? And I'm going to get up on stage. This guy, this sort of pointy-headed, would-be intellectual. So I started to poke around on their website for sort of points of entry. And, the slogan is honor, duty, country. But it seemed pretty clear from the website that the word that they used the most, in some sense, the holiest word. And then when I got there, I learned that they even thought of it as a way to distinguish themselves from those technocratic drones at the Naval Academy, that word was leadership. Okay, so I wanted to talk about solitude. I decided I'm going to talk about solitude by talking about leadership. That's going to be the sort of the spiced meat that gets me past the guard dog. But then I had to figure out if there was actually a connection. Is there really a connection between solitude and leadership? Can I plausibly make this argument? So I thought about it a lot. And in the end, I came up with the skeleton of a very simple argument, which is that to be a leader, you need to be able to think for yourself. And to be able to think for yourself, you need what I defined earlier as solitude, which is the capacity to step away from the group. It requires intellectual independence. It also requires moral courage. And I think those things are gathered. I mean, I think they have many sources. But one requirement is the ability to separate yourself from the group. One requirement is what I'm calling solitude. That got me, so that was interesting, and without false modesty, it was a robustly received talk, and the piece went on to be taught at a number of academic institutions across the military, not just the undergraduate ones, but the Naval War College and so on and so forth. And it was taught in a few business schools and blah, blah, blah. But it got me thinking about leadership more broadly, something I'd never particularly been interested in, and how the word was used. Because I realized that it's not just that it was used at West Point, right? I mean, you hear that language everywhere in higher education, or you had started to hear that language everywhere in higher education. It's become a slogan, it's become a buzzword. That college president, I don't mind revealing, was at Claremont McKenna College, where I had a visiting fellowship for a few weeks. And actually, the way that conversation went, and I say this because it might be useful for later in our conversation, is that I walked in and he had just been appointed a few months earlier, and I think he'd come from a law school, and I think he was offended at my lack of deference just in my body language. But maybe that's why he said, you talk about liberal arts, because I do. I'm at a liberal arts college. No one has been able to define what the liberal arts are. And I tried to give him a definition that he didn't accept, and we can talk about it. But I also said to him, I just came from a philosophy class, and I asked the students what leadership means, because I hear the term everywhere, and none of them gave a satisfactory definition. And as it turned out, as he said, the college president couldn't give a satisfactory definition either. But what those students tended to, when they did give responses, and their responses, almost all of them, had to do with what being a leader does for you. Being a leader is going to give me freedom to choose my own path in life. Being a leader, I don't know if anyone said this directly, but they talked, it was clear that they were talking about making a lot of money, having high status. And that is what leadership means in the context of elite higher education. When schools like Princeton say, we're going to make you a leader, when they say that to parents about their kids, what they're really signaling is that we're going to make you a winner. Mm-hmm. That's what it really means. That's the euphemism. And yes, I think I'm certainly not the first person to talk about elite failure and the failure of our leadership class over the last 2 decades at least. I would say longer than that. Indeed, roughly coinciding with the period that we call meritocracy. Certainly the latter half of that period, which began, let's say, in the early 70s, as elite colleges, late 60s, changed their admissions policies. George Packer wrote a piece in the Atlantic, I think it was 2008, 2009, talked about the financial collapse. He talked about the disaster of the Iraq War. He may have talked about Enron, which people still remembered at that time. I could add many other examples, the Hillary Clinton campaign. Basically, okay, so I know I'm giving a long answer and I should interrupt myself, but you earlier mentioned, Shilo, my 2014 book, Excellent Sheep, which was my book about elite college. Well, it's really about the elite college admissions process rather than recruitment process per se, and what it does to the students who go through it, because that I think is the key, right? That to me is the key to the whole thing. What you have to be in high school, in middle school, sometimes in grade school, who you have to become to be the kind of person who's going to get into a place like Princeton. And in the last couple of chapters, really the last chapter of that book, I say, look at the elite that this system is produces, the adult elite. And let's tick off all the ways that its characteristics are the same as the characteristics of my excellent sheep at age 18. They're risk averse, they're unimaginative, they're in a sense anti-intellectual, they're self-serving. They are as a group self-enclosed. And so that's my answer.
If I were to talk about leadership in most places, what I think I would be talking about, or at least what people would be expecting me to talk about, is, yeah, success, winning, and also bossing people around and being in a position where people admire you and maybe even like you on Facebook. Leadership doesn't seem to have a particular objective. It doesn't seem to be aimed at accomplishing anything. It's simply a status that you are assigned. And it baffles me, and tell me if I'm wrong in my bafflement. It baffles me how education is necessarily linked to that.
Right, depends what you mean by education. Do you mean what we would probably both call real education, or do you mean being credentialed by an elite institution? Because being credentialed by an elite institution obviously propels you into the leadership class.
Yeah, I would talk about it in the most traditional and the most classical sense of education. And I'm wondering what in that was really aimed at making you a leader. If you read Cicero on the offices, or you read Cicero on the Republic, what you would not be reading about is how to be a leader. It would be, what kind of a person should you be in a particular environment, in a particular city, in a particular nation. It really wasn't talking about how do you put yourself out in front of everybody and say, follow me. It was more like, what kind of a person should you be as a citizen? Have we, in the pursuit of leadership, lost complete track of what education should do to make us citizens?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you said it exactly right. What kind of person? I think Alan Bloom said this in The Closing of the American Mind, and I think I quote this in Excellent Sheep. I'm going to paraphrase, but basically every educational system wants to produce a certain kind of person. How does education make us a leader? Look, I think quite frankly that within the classroom, maybe there are certain characteristics, certain elements of character that are cultivated and can be cultivated. And you know, as the Shilo's, I think, introduction suggested, I was very, or maybe it was you, Alan, I was very committed to being a teacher. I loved what happens in the classroom. But in terms of the formation of character, I think mostly it has to do with things that happen outside the classroom. I am the last person to be nostalgic for the old WASP elite that the meritocracy rightly supplanted. And not just because it would have excluded me as a Jew. But, and certainly, I think it's probably very safe to say that most WASP aristocrats were perfectly self-serving as a class. But one of the reasons that we got a meritocracy at all was because there were enough people in the WASP aristocracy who saw that things need to be done differently, not just in higher education, but in society in general. And I would go back even to Franklin Roosevelt and maybe Woodrow Wilson and the people who were running Yale at the time, because Yale in the 60s, because Yale took the lead in shifting to meritocracy. So there were enough people in that class who had a sense of what I would call true leadership, because it had been inculcated in them by their education. And what does it mean? Well, it's what I think they still talk about at West Point. It's not about you. Mm-hmm. It's not about you. It's about the strengthening, or at least the preservation of the institutions with which you've been charged. It is about the well-being of the people whose leadership you've been placed under. It's about, honor, duty, and country, or honor and duty at university. So I said, and I think, there was a whole way of doing education that was about inculcating that kind of character. As I suggested earlier, we now inculcate character too. I don't think we think of it that way, but of course, inevitably we do. And as I suggested, the elite college admissions process, which dominates the lives of all the many tens of thousands of kids who apply, hundreds of thousands who apply to elite colleges every year. And then as they carry on through college, through graduate school, through their adulthood, that creates a certain kind of person that I would say is actually very poorly equipped to be a leader in the true sense of the word, because it's about getting to the top. It's about getting to the top.
Let me switch.
Empty, sort of this empty, sorry, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Let me switch gears for a minute to content. Long ago, 1959, maybe not that long ago, E.P. Snow made himself notorious when he gave the Reed Lecture at Cambridge by describing what he called the two cultures, science and humanities. And he wasn't complimentary to the humanities because he thought the humanities were strangling science. Well, we're 64 years on from E.P. Snow and the two cultures, and you write about the two cultures too, about the sciences and the humanities, only you're afraid that science is destroying the humanities. What has changed in the interval?
Well, a very great deal has changed. And I should stipulate that I'm in no way anti-science. There's some humanists who are. I think it's a huge mistake. I think it often comes from incomprehension or fear or insecurity about their own position. As you said earlier in introducing me, I was a science major. My father was a professor of engineering. Other people in my immediate family became scientists. I think the sciences, broadly speaking, and I would include the social sciences, are a tremendous intellectual achievement. I mean, one of the greatest, maybe the greatest intellectual achievement, collective intellectual achievement in human history. I don't want to take anything away from the sciences. They're just not everything. I mean, I think the word to introduce at this point is scientism, which is a belief that science is adequate to answer all questions and solve all problems. You can think of somebody like Steven Pinker as an contemporary exponent of scientism. Now, in the university, this is a particular problem because as the modern university constituted itself starting in Prussia in 1810, and then eventually coming to the United States after the Civil War, and reshaping institutions like Princeton or Columbia, which had been colleges, what we would now call liberal arts colleges, the sciences became the standard of knowledge. The humanities don't fit that standard very well. I mean, certain branches have tried to, back in the 19th century, philology and, scholarly editing and so on and so forth. And those were kind of the first disciplines that the literary fields focused on. But to me, the humanities are fundamentally interpretive, and interpretation is not a science. So, the humanities have tried valiantly, and I would say foolishly and failingly, to define themselves in terms of science, or at least in default of that, to sell themselves to undergraduates, parents, politicians, in the case of public universities, and academic administrators as good for you on the job market. And I do argue in Excellent Sheep that the humanities are good for you on the job market, but first of all, that's never really going to be, it's not going to be enough to get people to actually do them, as we see, with plummeting enrollment rates in the humanities. But also, I think it buries the lead. And this is the fundamental point. What are they for? What are they good at? We can talk about that. I feel like my answer is long enough at this point, but that, I mean, that's what's happened, right? You know, actually, I didn't even answer your question. What's happened since the 50s? Well, Sputnik happened. I mean, we already had an economy that was largely driven by science. I mean, it's really World War II that makes the, you know, big science begins to come into existence, starting with the Manhattan Project. And then after the war, people say, well, how can we keep doing that for something other than the bomb? But, you know, the scientific establishment, now biomedicine, obviously information technology, has just continued to expand and get stronger and stronger.
Do you think people in the humanities, so to speak, are collaborating in their own demise?
Okay, so you're asking me to talk about what I think has happened to the humanities over the last, you know, 50, 40 years since American humanities professors flung themselves at the feet of critical French theory. Look, I abhor what has happened to the study of the humanities since then. It's alienated me from the moment I started graduate school. I think it's one of the reasons that I didn't end up staying in academia, which I should say was not a voluntary decision. But I couldn't get with the program. But I do want to say that I don't really think that's the main reason enrollments have been dropping. I don't think it helps, but I don't think that's the main reason.
I'm wondering if you might put a sharper point. I mean, this is related to what you just said, but if you might put a sharper point on your critique of the Ivy League. I mean, I think that it's sort of, I don't know, there's a lot of criticisms of the Ivy League today. People eat that stuff up. You know, it's like, oh, someone's telling their kids not to go to the Ivy League, and it's on the news. You know what I mean? I mean, there's a certain kind of Ivy League bashing that people, especially conservatives, just really enjoy. You know, your book is interesting, and you are interesting because you are doing it after having spent 10 years there. Right. And so I'm curious if you might put a sharper point on the phrase excellent sheep. You alluded to that some earlier. What exactly does that mean? Where did you come up with that phrase? But even more interesting to me would be, are there colleges, or if not colleges, then courses of study that you might recommend for parents who are beginning to drink the Kool-Aid, who are saying, look, the Ivy League is not where Johnny should go. It might have been Yale back in the 50s or the 70s or the 80s, but not today. And so I'm curious if you could, you know, put a point on what it is about the Ivy League in particular, and then say more about what an alternative, an enriching alternative might be.
So first, I have to say that it's really not the Ivy League in particular, where I should say I spent actually 24 years, if you include my years as a student. And then my dad actually taught at Columbia, which is why I did at least my undergraduate degree there. So I kind of grew up with it.
Yeah.
Look, that piece, I mean, just to clear things up, that piece that you referred to in your introduction, don't send your kids to the Ivy League, is not exactly an essay that I wrote. It was a collage of excerpts from my book, Excellent Sheep, that came out a month before Excellent Sheep, that had been assembled by an editor at the New Republic. And I was actually very frustrated, not least with the title, partly because I don't think parents should be sending their kids anywhere. I think they should be helping their kid figure out where they want to go, but also because it's the Ivy League, if we understand that synecdochically, because I'm really talking about elite education in general, and I would include at the least 60, 80 schools. But really, if you look at, I mean, I think I counted it at that point, that was the number of schools that had admissions rates of less than 1/3. Now it's probably more because admissions rates continue to drop. And if you look at schools that are considered selective, sort of in the, you sort of officially, it's over 200. Obviously, most of those are not as selective. But I think it's worth making this point and including maybe even that large a number, because it's about, again, it's not even about what happens at the schools, although we can talk about that. And since Excellent Sheep came out in 2014, We have the whole wokeness thing, which I didn't even talk about because it didn't exist then. But it's not primarily about what happens at the schools. It's about who you become in order to get into those schools. And, so what would I say to parents? I mean, but it's hard, right? I mean, I've talked to parents. I've talked at a bunch of different private high schools and some parent groups. It's hard because parents are understandably concerned about their children's future, and they are also unreasonably concerned about their children's future. So listen, to me, and I am not on the right, I'm on the left, and to me, ultimately, much of this is rooted in the ever-increasing inequality in our economy. So if as we are increasingly sorted into winners and losers, and the gap between winners and losers gets greater and greater, it's understandable that parents are really going to want to push their students to a school that they think is going to maximize their ability to be one of the winners. You can't even really be middle class anymore. You have to, I mean, the middle class is collapsing from both sides. So you have to be at least upper middle class. Add to that the fact that in the 50s and 60s and even in the 70s, we had public institutions of higher education that were really good and really cheap. The University of California, the best of them, did not charge tuition until the 1980s. It didn't even charge fees until the 1970s. Obviously, that's not the case anymore. And the quality of those schools has declined because they've been starved, I would argue, because they've been starved of public funds. So what do you do? Where do you send your kid? I mean, or where do you encourage your kid to go? It depends what you want. How many parents are really committed to their kid getting what we called before a genuine education, a real education? Intellectual challenge, running the risk of coming out at the end of college a very different person than you went in, running the risk of becoming kindled by a subject that isn't obviously negotiable on the job market, that isn't a STEM field. How many parents want to do that? For those who do, I do still think there are some schools, but I think each of them are just kind of one-offs. The University of Chicago seems to have made a commitment. I live in Portland, Oregon. Reed College, which really seems to have lost its mind with wokeness, is also a very rigorous academic institution. And I think competes with Chicago for the highest percentage of graduates who get PhDs. And we can name some other schools, the St. John's Great Books College. But the St. John's Great Books Colleges, I mean, the number of students who apply to those schools every year, I've inferred from numbers that are publicly available, is under 1,000. Under 1,000. And the number that applies to Stanford, I think at this point, is over 50,000.
Can you define the term that you used, excellent sheep?
Oh, right, excellent
Where did
sheep.
that come from?
Okay, yeah. That came from a student of mine. In fact, I think it was in that same conversation, in that class on the literature of friendship, because I was talking about solitude, and it really just it was some kind of associative leap that she made that just kind of burst out of her mouth, because I wasn't really saying this, or I guess I was implying it maybe without realizing it. And she said, "Are you saying that we're all just like really excellent sheep?" And I thought that was just perfect. And I had to fight to make that the title of the book. But so let's break it down, right? Students who go to places like Princeton have clearly demonstrated a high degree of excellence. But what do we mean by excellence? It's not necessarily what the word means in the street, in common language, so to speak. There are very specific ways that excellence is supposed to be demonstrated. One of those is leadership. it's yet another buzzword, right? So you know, you have to do 12 or 15 extracurriculars, and you have to be the leaders of at least some of them, the leader of at least some of them, and you have to take lots of AP courses, and I think AP courses stink. I guess maybe their head is it still down the road, the College Board? And you know, so many people have told me that AP courses stink, as opposed, say, to the International Baccalaureate program. Basically, you become the consummate hoop jumper. You become the consummate fulfiller of adult expectations. You get A's. Now, we all know what A's means in college. Not necessarily very much. Probably even less in high school, where there's even more pressure on the school that you go to get good grades so you can get into a good college. What excellence does not develop in you is the ability to figure out what the hell you want and who the hell you are. And that's why you become a sheep, meaning someone who doesn't know how to direct their own life and can only follow the herd. And as you go through college at a place like Princeton, the herd generally forms 5 lines: law, medicine, finance, consulting, and tech. And most people go through one of those doors with the other sheep. And I should say that all of this that I'm saying comes from listening to my students at Yale. I was one of those professors who liked to talk to students and hang out in office hours with students. Another reason that I couldn't stay in academia, because I wasn't doing my research at every available moment. And the many hundreds, really thousands at this point, of people who've written to me over the last now 15 years, because I actually started to write about this in 2008, and the students I've met at many, 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 many schools, including Princeton. I was at Wig Clio in 2014 on the Excellent Sheep book tour. I'm going to say something really self-aggrandizing now, but for the sake of saying something valuable. The guy at Wig Clio who was running it, when he saw the crowd, he said, "This is the biggest crowd we've had since John Kennedy spoke here." Point being, students know this. Students, dare I say, even at Princeton, are hungry for meaning in their education, for something higher to aim at than what you talked about in terms of what leadership means, status and power.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that's true. I was part of a seminar earlier, well, last year. And the word leadership, I don't think ever came up once in that seminar. The seminar was about the politics and principles of the university. And I team taught it with Professor Robert George. The word leadership, I can't recollect that it was ever used the entire semester. What we did talk a lot about were issues about what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, and what kind of person should emerge from a university education. But I have a suspicion, tell me if I'm wrong, that this is a very rare moment in a lot of elite education today.
That is certainly my impression. And let me just say, because we didn't really talk about what the humanities are good for, that's what they're good for. And what somebody like Pinker doesn't understand is that the sciences cannot provide answers to those questions. They cannot tell you what's good, beautiful, what a good society looks like. He thinks they can, and he does the math, and it turns out that a good society looks exactly like what he already believes it looks like. And he doesn't understand that these are matters of value. Science deals with fact. The humanities, philosophy, literature, religious studies, the questions you just talked about, those are questions of value. I mean, science and the university, the modern university, was constituted through that distinction between fact and value. And it's been really since then, this is what a lot of what Woodrow Wilson was trying to do at Princeton, to reintroduce questions of value. How do you do that? I will just say one thing, though. I don't think those conversations are very common in the universities now. But I do think, as you say, I think they're rare, although we don't know what happens behind closed doors, which is, I think, sort of the safe, talk about safe spaces. That's the safe space for actual grappling with these issues. But one of the reasons I've written about this, one of the reasons that I think wokeness has spread like a prairie fire through the institutions of higher education is precisely because those institutions had become devoid of values higher than the values of the marketplace. Neoliberal education, right? So wokeness answers those questions. It tells you what's good and beautiful and true and desirable and what does a good society look like. But it, aside from the fact that I don't like those answers, it answers the questions. It doesn't raise the questions, it answers the questions. So those things are talked about in classes, they're just not debated.
If I had to put and this is a hypothetical, if you had to dream up recruitment slogans for an elite college or university, and what I'm thinking here is, I'm really thinking about two recruitment slogans. The one that the admissions staff would use to recruit students and put on the website and put on the letterhead and things like that. All right, there would be one recruitment slogan that would conform to that pattern. But what would another recruitment slogan look like, which tells potential students what's really going to happen to them? Can you give me A and B? You know, the official recruitment slogan and then the real recruitment slogan? What would they sound like?
Sure. I mean, I think the official recruitment slogan would be something like, we teach you to make a better world. Because, and actually I'm a connoisseur of these slogans, and specifically because I've traveled to a lot of universities and you'll see banners fluttering,
Oh yeah.
declaring the mission. And they change, right? I mean, there are different fashions in this, but now we are in the era of the social justice university, as I like to think of it. And it's all about making the world a better place, changing the world for the better, blah, blah, blah. So they're selling a certain kind of normative education. What's really going on, I think, is what's been going on really not just throughout the meritocracy, but even earlier, which is the real slogan would be, we're going to help you become a winner, or we're going to help you get to the top, or we reproduce the class system. And by the way, I don't think those two things that make the world a better place, be a young social justice revolutionary, I don't think, I mean, in theory, that's quite incompatible with, we're going to help you get a place at the high table from which the crumbs will fall to most everybody else. But in practice, I think the wokeness is just a fig leaf. It's just a moral alibi. Mm-hmm. And we've seen no change, as far as I know, in the postgraduate destinations of, places like Princeton, law, medicine, finance, consulting, and tech, but they'll just say, come work at this bank so you can make the world a better place. Come work at Facebook so you can make the world a better place. And, you're invited to fool yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you might say a word about why you left academia. You have this essay, Why I Left Academia. And one of the things we do in the Madison program is we try to mentor young PhDs. And your essay, if read by a young PhD, I suspect would be intimidating to say the least, although sobering as well. I mean, before we came on, I was talking to you about, on one of the pages of the essay, you list the many schools to which you applied with very good credentials. You were already on the faculty at Yale, for example, when you applied to all of these schools, and were nonetheless turned down. And this is part of why you're not in academia now. And so I'm curious whether you have advice to people who are trying to get into academia, or people who are trying to stay in it, perhaps people of the cast of mind that you are, that teaching is what matters, that the students are what matters, et cetera. But just in general, how to navigate, the obstacles that they face.
Listen, it's really, really tough. I mean, I talk a lot, I maybe don't use the word a lot, but I talk a lot about ideals, or my ideals, and we've been talking about ideals for education. But I always try to talk as frankly as possible and as fully as necessary about the real practical obstacles to living out any ideals, including the ones that I talk about. It's incredibly hard. I mean, look, we need to face facts. The academic job market, and specifically the academic job market in the humanities, and really in the social sciences, maybe outside of economics. I don't know how psychology is doing. I know their enrollments have done pretty well. But most of the social sciences and all of the humanities, the job market has been an absolute disaster for decades, and it just keeps getting worse. And there doesn't seem to be, I looked at the numbers recently, the number of PhDs being produced in those fields has not declined very much. So we're still churning out all these PhDs, and there are fewer and fewer places for them. I talk in that essay, which I wrote specifically for the book, Why I Left Academia, about all the things that I did wrong. Spending too much time on teaching, talking to students, writing for a general audience, New York Times Book Review and so forth. And why I knew that I was hurting myself, but did it anyway, because like I say in the essay, I didn't think that I could put my soul aside for 10 or 20 years and still be able to find it at the end. And that all is very noble, but here I am, and I don't have a job. And then at the end of the piece, I say, look, that was all about me. But the real big picture here is what I said a minute ago, that there just aren't jobs anymore. As with, for instance, the arts, and I have a whole book about what's happened to the arts economy called The Death of the Artist. Academia benefits from the fact that there are always be lots of very gifted young people who, maybe for reasons of idealism or just passion, are going to continue to go into those fields. History and English lit and religious studies and political science and so forth. In other words, supply is not adjusting to meet demand. And you go in with the confidence of youth, thinking that you're going to be an exception. And maybe somebody well-meaning says, there's always room in this field for good people who work hard. That's a lie. That is not true. And then maybe you add to that the fact maybe you're conservative, or maybe you're just like me, you're kind of a heterodox progressive. And you know that that means that you have to keep your mouth shut or risk an even tougher road. I'm sorry if you were looking for something more positive. I mean, here's what I would say, and I say this about trying to become an artist in the artist book. So let me just end with this. I'm not trying to discourage anyone. I'm trying to open people's eyes, and I'm trying to say, you need to be prepared to have a plan B. You need to know that it might not, and quite frankly, probably won't work out for you to get a faculty position and ultimately a ladder faculty position and a tenured position ultimately. And you need to think all along about what else you're going to do with your life. And at best, you don't just start a new career path from nothing when you're 30 or 35. You try to use the skills you've acquired to do something else. And that might mean teaching in a private school, becoming a member of the clergy, I don't know, psychologist. I'm thinking of specific things. I knew that Yale graduates, a librarian, etc.
A friend asked me a few weeks ago to create a description of something he called civics education. And this is another history person. I'm a history person. He was looking at what it would take to create a program, a description of civics education. And when he asked me that, I realized that in 35 years in higher education, I had heard a lot about leadership, but nothing about education for citizenship. What do you think? What do you think a civic education should look like?
That's a good question. So first of all, just a small answer that actually didn't occur to me for years of thinking about core curricula and so forth. It astonishes me that there isn't a mandatory course in every American college on the documents of American history. I think I started to think about this because I realized that almost nobody reads the Constitution. It's clear from the things that people say that they don't even know what's in the document. You know, we're going to change the Senate. Well, it says in the Constitution that you can't change the number of senators from any state without the state's own consent. That's not going to happen. Okay, so you read the Constitution and the Federalist Papers and blah, blah, blah. And of course, you're going to argue about them. You should argue about them, but at least you're going to know what's in them. So I would say, let's start with that. Let's have a one-semester course in the basic documents of American history, going forward into the 20th and 21st centuries, but focusing on the founding documents. More broadly, as I'm sure you know, the idea of education for citizenship was central to the way that higher education understood itself, especially, probably you can go back to the late 19th century, but certainly in the 20th century after the war, the famous Harvard Red Book, which is a famous document in the history of American higher education. I think it's called the Red Book because it's got red covers, but I think the title is Education in a Free Society, or Education for a Free Society. So all of a sudden, it's after the war, GI Bill. We are in the middle of actually quintupling the number of American college students, huge build out of American public education, in particular, public higher education. We are moving from some kind of oligarchy or aristocracy where political participation, unofficial of course, where political participation is confined to a relatively small group of people and a relatively homogenous group of people, to now a real broad-based citizenship, not just nominal citizenship. Okay, so we're asking ourselves, what do people need to know to become effective participants in the experiment of a free society, of a democratic republic? That is often answered in terms of curriculum. And I talked about a documents course. I certainly think that that's also the justification for a great books course, great Western books, more than a course, maybe several courses. Like I taught at Columbia, like I did at Columbia. I wrote a piece about that recently. But fundamentally, and Andrew Dobanko talks about this a lot, and he talks about it in his book called College, it's about the way you conduct education. I mean, one of the things, sorry to digress a little bit, but one of the things that I hate about talking about leadership in the context of higher ed, and I would say the same thing about creativity, another buzzword, and ethics, and now citizenship, is that they're not things you like teach people in a frontal way. You don't like give somebody a course in leadership or a course in creativity where, I don't know, you read stuff about creativity. They are emergent qualities from actions, from activities. So Dobanko talks about the seminar in particular as being kind of a training ground for democratic deliberation. You learn how to listen to other people, how to change your mind, how to make rational arguments. And I think that's the core of the idea, even more than any particular syllabus. And needless to say, we're screwing ourselves out of that too. Listen, I want to say I'm not without hope. I have an ever renewing source of hope in the hungers of 18 to 22-year-olds. Mm-hmm. They want meaning. I think they want genuine debate. I think they're hungry for knowledge. I think a lot of them know that they're being sold a bill of goods, both in terms of the sort of empty, value-free technocratic thing and in terms of the authoritarian woke thing. And I think a lot of them are just, like a lot of professors, are just keeping their heads down. But once you give people permission, that's why regimes collapse so quickly. Like, the communist regimes collapse so quickly, usually without a shot being fired, because they lost legitimacy, because enough people, and then everybody says, yeah, I never believed this stuff either.
It's like Václav Havel's greengrocer.
It's exactly like that. It's nominal compliance. That's right.
So it looks to me like we have about 5 minutes left before we turn it over to audience questions. I wanted to shift topics just a bit. You are a professor, or were a professor of English, and I can recall English when I was an undergraduate was among my favorite things to do and read and study, certainly literature. And I had the very wise advice not to go to graduate school to study it. Because if I did, I would no longer love it. And to this day, my love has been preserved, and I'm grateful for that, because I didn't subject that love or longing to graduate school, the pressures of graduate school. So I'm curious what you think has gone wrong with the teaching, reading, writing of literature today. If you could, I know that's a lot to ask in 5 minutes, but
yeah. Well, I mean, this returns us to something we were talking about before. There are a bunch of different things, and some of them are very long-standing. But to me, what's most obvious, and has been true for decades, was true when I started graduate school in 1989, is that it's been politicized. And literature is, which means that literature is interpreted through the lenses of and understood to have its value in reference to categories that are not proper to literature itself. They really come from the social sciences, or sort of, social sciences / kind of post-Enlightenment theory, which are sort of one big kind of philosophical glob. Foucault, most importantly. They are masks for power, for hierarchical oppression. We're going to unmask them. We're going to drain them of their poisonous, persuasive power. You're going to find out how Shakespeare, was a racist and a sexist, but more that his, that his plays kind of inculcate, hierarchical systems of oppression. Nothing about what you can learn, what the work can teach you, and nothing about taking the work on its own terms. Nothing about how it can change you as an individual. Individuals, bourgeois individualism. That's already a bad category. And while I said before that I don't think that the collapse in enrollments in the humanities is mainly because of this, I think if you tell people enough times that these works are, embodiments of evil, a lot of them will draw the logical conclusion that maybe we just shouldn't read them at all. Why not just forget about them? And I only have an anecdotal evidence for this. I think it was somebody at Williams who said this to me, that the students who would have been studying the humanities 20 or 30 years ago, they're not going into STEM for the most part. Probably their interests and their aptitudes don't really run to STEM. They're going into the social sciences, where, if the whole idea is to break down these systems of oppression, well, the social sciences obviously give you a much more direct route to do that. I mentioned in one of my essays that there was a woman I started graduate school with, a very, very smart and very well read, and it was all the rhetoric of all the politicized rhetoric, and she dropped out to go to law school because she really did want to change the world. She was a strong feminist. She believed in those issues. She wanted to make a difference. She realized that writing a monograph about Paradise Lost was not what was going to do it. So that's the main thing that I think is going on wrong.
Well, we're at the point where we want to pivot to questions that have come in to us as we've been talking, and I'll lead off. Shilo and I can keep doing our tag team match here, one after the other. But I want to lead off with a question that came in here, actually from an old friend of mine. So he'll be flattered, I'm sure, that I picked this up. And his question runs like this: do you have an opinion on roughly what percentage of high school graduates should go on to college?
Right. So this is, yes, this is a question people talk about a lot and criticize the rhetoric that, from what I understand, started with Clinton about everybody should go to college, or the goal at least should be as many people as possible should go to college. And what has that really done for us? And are too many people graduating? It's obviously too expensive, people taking on too much debt. Look, a couple things. First of all, that's fundamentally an economics question. It's not really a question of value. So how many, the answer to that question is going to be, how many college graduates does the economy need? And clearly there has been a growth in demand for college graduates. There's also credential creep, and people can argue, people have argued that a lot of the jobs that require college degrees don't really need college degrees. Fair enough. Of course, as high schools get worse and worse, it becomes understandable that people want graduates with college degrees, maybe with associate's degrees. The other thing, and I'm not projecting, I'm not saying that your questioner is asking this, but sometimes when I hear that question, there's a certain amount of classism involved. Like, and what I would say to that is, there are a lot of dumb rich kids in college who don't belong in college. There are a lot of smart poor kids who can't get to college because they had lousy educations and or because college is too expensive for them. Even public university is too expensive for them. So sure, there are plenty of people who don't belong in college, but they aren't necessarily the ones that we automatically think. And we need to make better provisions for those who don't graduate for college or don't go to college. In other words, trade school, talking about trade school is a good option for people, especially for young men. We know the crisis with young men. Only 42%, the last time I checked, 42% of college graduates are men now, new college graduates. Again, I'm a progressive, unions, minimum wage. It's understandable why people go to college. There's still a huge wage premium for going to college, even with debt. Even if you subtract that, net out debt, it's still worth it if you make it all the way through. So part of the problem is that we've constructed an economy where people feel like they don't have a choice.
Someone's asked for your take on a current issue, which normally I wouldn't offer you, but it's relevant and I'm interested to hear what you say. So there's been this withdrawal from US News of the top law schools. And now I've heard it's also extended to some medical schools. And so this person is curious what you make of this. I wonder, is it a sort of self-hating situation? Is it that they're all frauds? At Columbia, where you said you taught, got into some hot water some years ago for being fraudulent, and there's a number of schools that have withdrawn for similar reasons. So what's going on with the kind of, the action and politics around the rankings?
Yeah. This is my understanding, and it may not be the most well-informed, but because I haven't read a lot about this. But first of all, it's only in law and medicine. It's not, as far as I know, at the undergraduate level. It's only, as far as I know, the most elite schools. Yale, I don't know, I think it's been the top ranked school forever. The rankings among the top schools barely ever change. They can afford to withdraw. Yale Law School is always going, I think it's probably fair to say that Yale Law School is always going to be the most desirable law school, and followed closely by Harvard and Michigan and maybe Berkeley or whatever the top ones. They don't need the rankings. They don't need them. It's a great form of virtue signaling to withdraw from the rankings, because everybody hates the rankings. Everybody hates rankings in general. They hate SATs. They're racist, blah, blah, blah. And then the other thing that I've heard, although I haven't thought about whether this makes sense to me, is that they're preparing for the end of affirmative action. And for reasons that I don't quite understand, this is going to give them more freedom to maneuver. I guess it because it might affect some of their metrics on the rankings. The things they do in response to the end of affirmative action, okay, so that's what it means, could potentially affect their rankings. So let's withdraw from rankings now before the decision comes down.
We've had a few questions come in the question queue about wokeness. And it occurred to me, maybe we should drop back just a moment and ask you to define this.
Right. It's kind of it's amorphous. People use the word a lot. I use the word a lot. Some people don't like to use the word. It's amorphous, meaning that it's not like there's a theory. Anyone's theorized wokeness the way you can point to what Marxism was. I would say a couple of things are fundamental to it. It understands society and the individual in terms of groups, in terms of specific identity groups that I don't need to list. So your characteristics as an individual are reduced to your place on the your node on the intersectional grid, how you think, how you feel. And that's how you get people saying, so-and-so isn't politically Black, so-and-so isn't really Black, because they don't have the opinions that's supposed to come with being Black. Your experience, never mind all the many, many, many other factors that define your consciousness and your experience. Some are personal, some have to do with other groups that don't count. Second, those groups are understood to exist in a hierarchy of oppression, of oppressor and oppressed, a hierarchy of oppression. And in every situation, there is some kind of group oppression going on. So I think the way they'll put it is, don't ask if racism exists in this situation, ask how it is manifesting in this situation. It is understood to be manifesting in every situation. Another thing, and we talked about Foucault, is that it understands everything in terms of power. I mean, this is the sense when people talk about how wokeness is kind of Marxist or post-Marxist or neo-Marxist, it's that, so it's groups, but it's different groups. It's not classes, it's not economic classes, and that politics and society must always be understood as a competition for power among those classes, and discourse, this is Foucault, reason, are simply the mask of power. They are simply expressions of power. So reason doesn't exist. And that leads to another fundamental characteristic of wokeness, which is illiberalism. Wesley Yang, who I think is maybe the most brilliant commentator on all of this, coined the term a few years ago, the successor ideology. He calls wokeness the successor ideology. He means the successor to liberalism. Liberalism, not in the Hillary Clinton sense or the me sense, but in the sense that we mean it when we talk about liberal democracy. And so now we have illiberalisms on both ends of the political spectrum, but left illiberalism says that all of those, it's very anti-enlightenment, and it says that all of those freedom of speech, due process, other enlightenment values and principles and institutions are simply, again, expressions of power, ways for dominant groups to retain their dominance. And that's also why wokeness focuses so much on language, because it believes that language is the way to, and that's why I would say, lastly, that we talk about cancel culture a lot, obviously, in relation to wokeness. I would say that cancel culture isn't just associated with wokeness, it's an essential element of wokeness. Mm-hmm. It's part of the point.
If that's if that is the case, then one person has asked, what do you think is the first step that an 18-year-old arriving at college or university, what is the first step they should take to challenge the status quo of wokeness in the college or the university?
So again, be careful. I don't want anyone, I mean, it's really hard. It's really hard because the ostracism is swift and certain. I think maybe the first step is to start finding people who believe as you do. I was going to say who agree with you, but of course I mean agree to disagree. People who are also alienated from this, people who also come to college because they want to debate and think and change their minds and so on and so forth. So I would say I'm saying start quietly, start in private life, start with a group of people that you can have that kind of experience with. And also because there's safety in numbers, and the greater the numbers, the greater the safety. I would ultimately like to see, I think some students have tried to do this, students organizing formal discussion groups where they're planting a flag and saying formal debating groups. There was, I think they had one at Williams, difficult conversations or something like that. And then they proposed their first topic and the president said, no, I'm sorry, that's too. Okay, so, but I mean, yeah.
Okay, so I said I wouldn't do this, but there are two more people who want your hot takes on various contemporary issues. One involves the reform of the board. And if you don't know, then don't just say, I don't know what you're talking about. The new college in Florida.
Yeah.
And so that one first, and I'll get another one in. Folks are asking about the Students for Fair Admissions case. The Supreme Court, how that might change higher ed. So new college and Supreme Court.
Okay, so new college. Look, obviously, I'm a big critic of what's been happening at universities and of wokeness. I don't think that the right, or call them conservatives, Republicans, whatever you want to call them, I don't think that their response, by and large, been productive or constructive. And obviously DeSantis is building a brand based on this thing. And I don't like what they're doing at New College, not because I necessarily like what New College does, but it's a tiny institution. It was created by, progressives, or recreated, I think, is the history of it a long time ago. The students who go there want that kind of thing. It's a really small school. I think their total enrollment is like 700, and I think this is just. This is just political brand building for DeSantis and Chris Rufo, and it looks really and is really authoritarian and ugly, and it's just going to give the legitimate desire to push back against this kind of woke orthodoxy. It's just going to give it a bad name. As for the affirmative action case, I think there's no question whatsoever that colleges like Harvard are discriminating against Asian American students in exactly the same ways they discriminated against Jewish students in the first half of the 20th century. Nobody wants to talk about this. Everybody knows it. I think that affirmative action in general is a problematic solution to the problem it addresses, but the only one we've had. The reason it's problematic is that it starts way too late in a young person's life. It's trying to rebalance the scales of opportunity at age 18, when really it needs to start at age 0. And there are all kinds of problems with affirmative action, starting with the fact that most of the students who get into elite schools under affirmative action are from comfortable backgrounds, and are often not, the Black students are often not descendants of American slaves. I think the majority of students of African descent at Harvard are both from upper middle class backgrounds and not descendants of American slaves. They're children of immigrants, or they're international students, or whatever. But if they want to maintain their numbers of Black and Hispanic students and give Asians to stop discriminating against Asian students, there is another pool that they can draw from, and that's white students. But white students, lots of really good white students who deserve to get in. Lots of white students who are legacies, who are recruited athletes. I don't think either of those groups belongs at those schools. But for financial reasons, legacies are what, 15% or so of students at Harvard, Princeton, Yale. And they tend to be wealthy and they tend to be reliable donors. And people talk about the fact that Princeton gives something like, I don't know, probably about 60% of Princeton students get financial aid. That means 40% don't. 40% can just write a check. Schools don't want to lose that constituency. So, yeah.
You just published very recently a short piece. It's not in this book, but I'm going to step outside the book just for a
Yeah,
moment,
sure.
because as a history person, this took my eye. And this piece that you wrote was an assault on the phrase "the right side of history."
Yeah.
And the way this gets deployed, that there are some people who are on the wrong side of history and others are on the right side of history. And presumably those who are on the wrong side need to get with the program and move over and get on the right side of history, because otherwise the train's going to leave the station without them, or the steamroller is going to move over them, or whatever. They're going to wind up in the dustbin. You know what the analogies are. Does history have sides?
Right. History does not have sides. I criticize in this piece specifically the way the word is used, the phrase is used by progressives, the right side of history, or correlatively, history will judge them. I think sometimes it's used on the right side of the political spectrum as well, but progressives love this idea. It's an implicit in the very word progressive is this idea that history has, as King was not the first to say, a moral arc. But that's an illusion. Okay, when you say the right side of history, you're simply you're kind of treating the future like a ventriloquist dummy. When you say history will judge, you know, you think that you're going to win, basically. And my point is, when I say that history doesn't have sides, is that there, you know, it's not like there are always sides. Like one side isn't going to win. This struggle that we have between left and right, which is fundamentally struggles of values and of particular ways of viewing society, it's been going on for centuries. I think it will continue into the future. And there's this kind of triumphalism. I think it's, as I say in the piece, I think ultimately it's like many things in society now, in sort of political, social thought, it's kind of crypto-religious. It's kind of an unconscious religious survival, that there's some kind of spiritual force. I mean, of course, Hegel talked about the Geist, right? There's some kind of spiritual force behind history that's moving it in a certain direction. And the progressive thinks that it's moving it towards a certain conception that, you know, that's their conception. But, you know, I mean, I believe that history is one damn thing after another. And when you think that you're on the right side of history, not only do you become insufferably arrogant, but I think you also become dangerously complacent, because you think you can kind of just sit back and let history do the work for you.
If you had to identify what history education should look like in a college or a university, what do you think it would contain?
God, I've never thought about that. Well, what do you think it should contain?
A lot of courses that would talk about Abraham Lincoln and the American Civil War. And I'm saying that as
well, are you talking about?
I'm padding my own specialty.
Are you talking about the what a history major should study, or what every student should study?
No, what I think other students should. Where and what should a person who graduates with an undergraduate degree from a college, especially an elite college and university, what should they have studied? What kind of education should they have had in history? I mean, you can say, I can actually ask the same thing about what their education, let's say in English literature, should look like. You know, it should have Bunyan, it should have Austen, it should have Dickens.
Right.
What do you think a history education should look
Right.
like?
So
otherwise, we fall prey to this right side of history arrogance.
Right. Right. I see what you're saying. I mean, so obviously I'm just speaking extemporaneously because I haven't thought about it. But I think maybe you can think about it in terms of a series of concentric circles. So we're Americans and we need to know our history. And America is part of the West, so we need to know European history. And look, especially now, because we live in a globalized world and we do have a society that increasingly includes people from non-Western parts of the world, we should know something of world history. But of course, I don't trust professors to teach it the way I would want them to teach it. But what you're making me realize is that we can talk about content, but what do we, sort of what's the take home that we want students to have? And the problem, I mean, so much of the problem with the way literature is taught now, and undoubtedly history is taught now, is that our values are projected onto the past. So the Iliad is like really sexist, so we condemn the Iliad. But like the goal of reading the Iliad, or one of them, is to try to see the world the way Homer saw the world, right? I mean, Homer in quotes, right? So to study history in a way that enables you to see as well as you can, to understand how people in the past saw their own world. And when you do that, you inevitably kind of decenter yourself and start to learn that there are very different ways of looking at the world. I mean, the past in some ways is like another country. Didn't somebody say that once? The past is another country.
Yeah, the past is a different country. They do things differently over there. Yeah.
Well, I mean, let's use that metaphor, right? I mean, when everybody knows that when you go to a different country, you see yourself in a way more clearly than you ever have before, because you realize all the things that you take for granted that people in France or people in Indonesia don't take for granted, because they see the world differently, they organize society differently. So that the past also can serve that function.
So there's a couple versions of this question floating around, and I say this. So outside of my window here at Princeton right now, they're building a gigantic new engineering complex at what has been, for many years, a bastion of the liberal arts and the humanities, and has produced extraordinary writers and of these sorts of things. And so the people are saying that ship has in a way sailed. You mentioned, finance, engineering, technology. I forget the categories that you mentioned, but this is what people major in. Any school worth its own salt better expand its engineering program to attract new majors in computer science and whatnot. I've dealt with that firsthand, having worked in engineering college for 6 years. And so they're asking whether the humanities can save themselves, or how they might save themselves, by some sort of productive integration into this. I mean, in other words, is the solution a kind of integration of the two halves of the university for some kind of more holistic education? Is that even realistic? I used to get told, for example, engineering, and it's not false, engineering, computer science course requirements are so intense that we don't really have much room for that sort of thing. After all, these people are building bridges. Do you want the bridges to fall down, or do you want them to be able to read Shakespeare? You take your pick. And so, there's this question about what do the humanities do in this environment? Is there a way for them to ally with the engineering and computer science, or are they just doomed?
Yeah, look, can I just jump on top of what Shilo was saying? Because one of the people who asked a question like that really put it in very concrete terms. Her daughter was a biochem major. She's a physician, but she read a lot of literature, and she even did grand rounds reading Dickens and used Dostoevsky in a paper that she wrote on disorders. Is there a way of making these two cultures work together in a worthwhile education?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I've always been resistant to that. And actually, Annika and I talked about this on your podcast. She asked me about it in reference to Stanford, where she went and where they're talking about this. I mean, not to listen. So the first thing I would say is the whole point of the humanities to me is that they're relevant for everything. They are an education in how to be a person. They're an education in thinking broadly and feeling deeply and understanding other people and beginning to see, again, we were just talking about this, how to understand that people unlike you are the centers of their own universe with their own perspectives. And so I think that they are valuable for anything you will do in life. Certainly being a doctor, that's an easy one. I think a lot of the problems with tech and how it ends up getting implemented I will read about some disaster or some looming disaster and think, these are people who never took a humanities course. They don't know how to think about the human dimension of the technology they're creating. But what I worry about is that, we're going to save the humanities by integrating them with science is just going to be another you know, the humanities are good for job market skills. They're just another way of justifying the humanities in terms that are not proper to the humanities. So they might, you know, keep them on some kind of life support, but by definition, as a subordinate partner, serving the needs of some other field. And let me just say, I mean, you know, this business, they don't have time to read Shakespeare. I mean, the whole way we construct, it's just so sad because we're the only country, as far as I know, maybe there are a few small exceptions, where you don't just study one thing as an undergraduate, where the whole point of undergraduate work is to get a broad education. And that's why we have majors. And this was, you know, this is an invention of the early 20th century, precisely as we were moving to technocratic education. The idea that, you know, you're going to take, I don't know, 32 courses at Princeton, 36 courses at Princeton, and you really don't have time for 6 or 8 humanities courses because you have to do so much in your engineering major. I don't believe it. And let me, just the last thing, because I know we're getting close to the end of our time. What I say to elite college students about making more interesting choices with their life, I would also say to elite colleges, you're Princeton. You're always going to have that prestige. You know, I mean, build your engineering center, sure, but this idea that you have to completely, people are still going to want to go to Princeton. You have the luxury that a lot of other schools don't have to continue to stand by values other than, or in addition, I mean, in other words, in addition to the values embodied by the STEM fields. You can do both, you can have it all. And there's no excuse for you lacking the courage to continue to stand on the importance of a liberal arts education for engineering majors and for everybody.
Someone has put a question here, slightly skeptical question. The questioner asked, what does any of this have to do with the kids are not okay? Taking a riff on the title that I gave to this. Frame an answer to that by telling us in 1 minute what you would say to one of your excellent sheep that they should do with their education, with their lives, what they're doing right there as an undergraduate.
Look, I mean, that was your title, The Kids Are Not Okay.
Right.
But I mean, I'm fine with that because as long as this is how I start Excellent Sheep. They're miserable. They're miserable. And everybody knows this now. There are an endless number of statistics. And it's gotten even worse since the iPhone debuted, which was after I wrote the book. Or at least it was really taken up after I wrote the book in a major way. It became a factor. I say to students, listen, I'm up here, I'm preaching. If you don't buy it, fine. Ask yourself, is this working for you? I mean, are you happy? I know happy is a slippery word. Are you miserable? Some students, they're doing great. A lot of students are miserable. They're the ones who've written to me long confessional letters, emails about how unhappy they are. I am not telling anyone what to do with their life or what to study. I'm telling them to figure out what they care about, figure out what they're good at, what they like, what they care about, what they want their life to look like. And if that's engineering, fantastic. If that's medicine, terrific. But if it's something that isn't lucrative or that your parents aren't so happy you want to pursue, well, you need to find the courage to do that because you're not going to have a happy life. You're not going to have a happy life. I mean, bottom line, before we get to any values, good society, you look at statistics about, you know, various forms of, you know, measures of life satisfaction among doctors, lawyers, and bankers. They're not happy people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I am deeply regretful to have to say that this really does bring us to the end of our session and the end of our time with you, Bill Deresiewicz, for which I thank you very deeply. I wish we could have dealt with every question that came in, and what a load of questions remain. But I would say, at the very least, to everyone who's been part of this, that the best place to take questions that you still have outstanding is to the End of Solitude and to Bill Deresiewicz's website, which is simply billderesiewicz.com.
And I just want to mention, we have a number of live programs all throughout the semester at the Madison program, both at the Princeton campus and elsewhere. So immediately of interest would be in February, the man on this call, Alan Guelzo, is going to be on stage at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. with Richard Brookhiser and Lucas Morell to discuss a new anniversary edition of his great biography on Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President. That'll also be aired on C-SPAN, so keep an eye out for Professor Guelzo's symposium on his great book. And then in April, an initiative that Professor Guelzo and I are both involved in, the initiative on statesmanship, will also have a great event with Joseph Horowitz and Sidney Outlaw on Dvorak's Prophecy, the vexed fate of Black classical music. But there are many other lectures on campus to look up on our website, so everybody check out jmp.princeton.edu.
So for this evening, we would say work hard, play hard, read lots, think deeply, and stay in touch through our James Madison Program website, jmp.princeton.edu. And for this evening, again, thanks to Bill Deresiewicz and regards to you all. We'll see you all again soon.